So tonight we're going to talk about healthy soil, healthy plants. And with me tonight is Gina Meissner, and she we don't garden entirely the same, perhaps. I'm not even sure, but I know she's a really good gardener. So the two of us are going to present this together. And if one of us doesn't have the answer, maybe the other one does, or we can look it up and find out the answer if we can't answer your question. So we can move on to the first slide. This workshop is based on information from the University of Minnesota College of Agriculture, Food, Environmental Science, and other accredited universities, and our experiences applying these practices as gardeners. One thing that master gardeners are required to do is not say, well, my grandma used to do it this way, but instead use evidence-based information when we respond to questions, so that you're actually getting tried and tested information from which to move forward. We can move on. The priorities of the master gardeners are listed here, and tonight we will be talking about horticulture skills, local food, and then clean water, because actually if you overuse fertilizers, it can impact the water table. And so that is why, and there's always caution and always an appropriate amount that can be used safely. And we'll talk about that more later, but just because a little fertilizer does a lot of good, a lot of fertilizer might not do much good and can cause your groundwater, damage your groundwater. So those are the priorities of master gardeners, and let's move forward. Oh, this one, the spacing got a little bit off when it went from a Mac to a PC, but I will introduce myself, and then I will have Gina introduce herself. I've lived in Cook County for 11 years. I grew up in southwestern Minnesota. Much different gardening down there than in Cook County, but joyful gardening in both places. I was a former school educator and a school administrator. I grow flowers and vegetables in Cook County, and I've been an avid gardener since 1973. I did some gardening with my mom and grandma when I was younger than that, but in terms of my own garden, that's when it started. I've been a master gardener for 22 years and learned gardening, of course, from my extension classes as well as my mom and grandma. Gina?
My name is Gina Meissner, and this fall it'll be 42 years that I've been a resident of Cook County. I grew up in the northwest suburbs of Chicago, Illinois, and I am a retired medical technologist from our local hospital here in town. I love to grow flowers, vegetables, and I have a pretty extensive fruit orchard, along with lots of grapes and raspberries and blueberries. Pretty much any fruit you can grow up here, I grow. I've been an avid gardener since 1981. I've been a master gardener. This is my 4th year, and I've been a master naturalist for 10 years. And I learned gardening from my mom, and she was an exceptional gardener and could garden in the clay and rocks up here and produce wonderful vegetables for us. So that's a little bit about me.
And we can move on to the next slide. Okay, just finding out about you. And if you could go to the chat and raise your hand if you're a first-time gardener. And Gina will report in. So we have a little bit of an idea. We have around 20 people, but where are our people? And Gina, what are you seeing from the chat?
I'm seeing 2 hands up.
Okay, so 2 people are first-time gardeners. How about raising your hand if you have gardened for 5 years or less?
There's one
And
hand
just in
up.
case you can't figure out where to do those buttons, you can just raise your hand physically, because I know that sometimes figuring out those buttons can be kind of complicated.
Yeah, we just can't see everybody on our screen, so.
So give me a show of hands if you've gardened for 5 years or less. I think there's three hands up.
Okay. And how about if more than 5 years of gardening? Would that be the rest then?
There's probably 7, 8.
Okay. Good. And then just some quick information about your soil, because that's really varies a lot in Cook County. So if you can, in my screen, the chat box is at the bottom. And if you could go to that and raise your hand if you have sandy soil, because that will help us just know a little bit more about what kind of gardening what kind of challenges you have in your gardening.
I'm seeing 4 people so far.
Okay, how about clay soil?
1, 2, 3, maybe 4 matching.
5.
Okay, and how about more of a loam soil?
And if you have loam soil, you better tell me where you live.
You know what,
Yeah,
with
we'll
new
be
gardeners here, you might want to do a quick, what is a loam soil?
rich black dirt that has porous air for roots to grow and water to go through. And if you really have a lot of rockies, I basically garden on rocks. And so if you have mostly rocks for soil, that's not one of them. Because I pretty much have to have a raised bed or a berm to garden, but
Well, there's nobody that raised their hand about a loam
okay.
soil.
I'm the only Rockies one. Okay. And have you ever had your soil tested? Raise your hand if the answer is yes.
1.
Okay. And let's move on. I think we did kind of the assessment as we went. And what we learned about the soil is just kind of like what we thought. It really depends upon where you live in Cook County. There's so many variables in Cook County. Even the growing zone that you're growing is different from one spot in the county to the next, which is very different from where I came from. I'm in 4B, and Gina, what is your growing zone?
3B, 4A.
Okay. So what a growing zone tells you is how quickly you can plant your things in the spring and how early your frost date will be. And so it really impacts how quickly your soil warms up. Mine doesn't warm up very fast because I'm really close to the harbor. And so I have to put plastic covers over the top of my gardens so that the soil can warm up a little bit faster. Otherwise, I'd be waiting until July to plant anything. My soil just doesn't warm up fast enough without some plastic covers. Okay, let's move on. Some of the important steps for gardening on the North Shore is to learn about your soil. And you can do that by digging in various places in your yard or garden. Now, if you have a raised bed, you can alter the soil that you have and put it in a raised bed along with amendments. Some soil is easy to grow in and others would not be. You want to examine your soil and see if you see organic matter, which would be small parts of leaves or grass and plant parts in the soil. My soil, if I was to dig up my ground and put it in a raised bed, it would be primarily rocks, beach rock, with a little bit of powdery dust in it. There would not be organic matter at all. So in my case, what I've had to do is sift out rocks, use a little bit of the dust, and then bring in dirt from various places, along with adding compost and amendments that we'll talk about later. Does your soil stick together like clay? So is it hard to dig into, hard to get a pitchfork in and to move things, or does it stick together really hard and doesn't have places where air can get in? That's challenging soil to work with. And so it isn't that you can't garden in it, but you do need to know some things to do to make it more amenable to growing things. So you'll want to take your gloves off and feel the texture of your soil. You know, if you squeeze it together, does it stick together in a hard mass, or does it crumble through your fingers, or does it just feel kind of rich and I don't know, just like it roots could expand in whatever it is you're holding in your hand. You can wet your soil and put it in the palm of your hand and close your hand, and that will let you know if it's going to stick together or if it's going to crumble. And if it sticks together, you do need more organic matter in your soil. And for gardening, you'll eventually want to remove the rocks. My husband made me a sifter, so I sift my soil, even though I had ordered double sifted soil for my first raised bed from Thorson's. There were still a lot of rocks in it. And so I did sift that soil to remove the rocks before I added it to my gardens, because roots can't go down if there's rocks underneath. They really need porous soil to do well. And so by removing the rocks, you're just going to make your plants more successful. And we can go on. Gina and I have both had different journeys here. Gina, do you want to talk first about your soil journey?
Oh, yeah. The soil where I live on East Maple Hill is basically clay with lots of rocks and big boulders. Matter of fact, I think boulders is the crop that grows best where I live. And matter of fact, my property way back in the early 1900s, they grew potatoes here. And then in the spring, they would take a dray with horses and they would gather all the boulders and put them on the back and then pile them up. And I have like 40, 50 foot long piles of these huge boulders that are maybe 20 feet wide and about 15 feet high. And on the 30 acres that I have, I've located 6 of those piles of boulders, and I am to this day adding to them. Since money was tight, I worked on developing composting skills so I could work the organic matter into the soil along with the mowed up leaves and grass clippings. I started out small. Matter of fact, tractor tire was my first raised bed. And over the span of 30 years, I finally ended up with a productive garden that is a good size. I did not, in the last 5 years, I've added bag compost and soil from St. Louis Soil and Water. But otherwise, it has always been just my own compost that I use to build up, to dig into the clay to loosen it and stuff. And that's why I started out small and then eventually was able to grow it big.
I was pretty naive when I moved up here. And I was going to be moving some perennials up here with my to plant when I first got up here. But lo and behold, I got up here and basically my yard had no soil. So needless to say, the plants I brought up, even though I planted them in that pile of rocks and a little bit of powder, very few of them survived. And so then I quickly thought, I'm not going to be able to vegetable garden up here, but I could have soil brought in and create some berms and do some flower gardening. And so I did that. We were doing some work around our house. And so they took some of the soil from around the foundation and they piled it and kind of spread it out. And then I had black dirt delivered and put on top of that and started with some berms, which are just mound shaped things, slightly different shapes around my yard that hold flowers and shrubs and a lot of pollinator plants now. And then I started reading about raised bed gardens and thought, okay, that would be a possibility. So we used some of that cruddy soil from around the house and put that in the first raised bed and then added some soil to that. And then bought some compost and added to it to loosen it up just a little bit. But eventually, as we had to move my raised beds, I sifted everything, got all of the rocks that were still hiding in there out, and then added more of the compost that I was making. And in the course of time, I've ended up with really successful gardens that are doing very well. So, even though we all have our own kind of limitations here, we can produce wonderful gardens in Cook County in spite of having a lot less soil than I was accustomed to. When we dug the basement for our house where we lived before and built the house, I asked them to save the rocks because I wanted to put in a rock garden. And at the end of the day, he had 6 little tiny small rocks around the base of a tree. And he said, well, that's all I've got. And the rest was black dirt in a great big pile. So very different than Cook County, but just you can still be just as successful here. We can move on. Thank you. One thing I want to tell you is that a lot of times you think the first thing you do, and probably would have been smart of me, the first thing to do would be to do a soil test when I moved here. But first of all, I didn't need a soil test to tell me I didn't have soil. And so I had to figure out what were the places I could get soil to add to whatever I had to create something. But in time, it is manageable to improve soil and have a successful garden here. And it's fun and productive and worthwhile. And my garden generates enough produce for my husband and myself, our neighbors. I fill my pantry with home canning and stored vegetables. And so I know you can be very successful. I have 2 raised beds at my home, and then I rent one from WTIP and at the community center. So that's why I am able to have just a little bit more garden produce than if I just had my 2 raised beds. But we are still eating onions and potatoes and canned food from last summer. So it doesn't take a huge garden to be successful here. In 2021, I had my first soil test. And so even after working for a few years, I still learned some things from my soil test. We can move on. Okay, so this is just looking at 2 of my raised beds. And can you tell anything about soil just by looking at it? You really can't. You can tell what color it is. And if you stuck your finger in there, you might be able to observe the texture. You wouldn't know what nutrients are in it. You wouldn't know the pH. You might be able to see some organic matter, but you really wouldn't know what fertilizer recommendations would be needed for what you're going to grow in that garden. And that's why you need a soil test. And I did spend some years, because even without having a soil test, I knew I just had really cruddy soil and I needed to work on it. And so that's why I didn't do it right away. But especially if you haven't had a lot of experience gardening, you'll want to have a soil test, because everything that you do in your garden to add things to make your potatoes grow better or your tomatoes grow better will be based upon what that soil test tells you. And so you can have you can go up to the community gardens, for instance, and look at all the gardens up there. And some of the gardens are far more successful than others. And basically, we're all dealing with the same starting point. Wherever Diane Booth got the soil for one raised garden, basically she probably used the same source for all of it. The difference is what amendments you put in, and each year you're given either 1 container of compost to add to the soil, or 2 if you're at the community garden. And so everybody's, I think, adding the same things like that, except knowing what are some of those other things that you can do to make your soil more productive. And that's really what this workshop is about, is knowing those other things that you can do besides just putting seed in the ground and watering it. And let's go to the next slide. So these are the kind of the components that and information you would need to get a soil test from the University of Minnesota. And there are places that do soil testing for farms, but there's not, other than the University of Minnesota, you're not going to find a more reliable source for testing your garden. And whether you're a flower gardener or a vegetable gardener, you would indicate on the forms that you fill out what kind of what you're trying to grow. And it doesn't take very long if you do it early in the season or at the end of the season, but it does take longer if you do it like in the height of planting season. So I will be sending another soil test in this year for my 2 gardens, home gardens. And I will be sending it in as soon as my garden can be, my soil can be worked. Just to let me know what amendments I should add, or if I don't need to add any amendments. And it does also is dependent upon what you're going to be growing in the garden, what you would want to add for amendments. So I still want to know how my balance is of the nutrients in the soil. So they have these things available at these little bags and the soil testing information available at the community center, or you can just go on the websites that you see listed in this PowerPoint that you'll be getting a copy of, and you can get your information through there as well. We can move on. Early steps forward. Do not add fertilizer or other nutrients to your soil until you get your results. And that will help you make choices about the amendments to add. And when you receive your results, you might want to contact a master gardener, Gina, myself, and we have another whole team of people who are interested in vegetable gardening, and they could help interpret the results for you. And while you wait for a soil test, be thinking about your current garden or your garden plans and determine if they're realistic for a successful garden. Ask yourself if your garden is in the right location. Is it too close to trees that will limit the sunlight? Will your garden get 8 hours of sunlight in that location? Is the garden close to a water source? Because carrying water to a garden is, the last few years we've had dry years and inconsistent rainfall. So you do want to have your garden close to where you can water it when needed, because gardens need about 1 inch of water a week if they haven't had rainfall. And raised beds are going to dry out a little bit faster than other gardens. So early steps, like what you can think about now and what you can do something about, is to think about, is your garden in the right spot? Okay, let's move forward. Gina, have there been any questions that have come up in the chat that you want to share or that need to be answered before we move on?
Nope, nothing's come up.
Does anybody have a question that you want to put in the Q&A to ask a question before we move on? I don't see any coming up, so let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so plants need nutrients for optimal health. So what I have done is list the 17 essential nutrients that all plants need to grow. There are macronutrients, and they're needed in larger quantities. And a soil test, like we just talked about, can tell you what nutrients your soil is lacking. So the primary nutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and they come from fertilizer and organic matter. And phosphorus and potassium come from weathering of soil particles. So there's certainly a lot of particles up here. There's a lot of rocks that have broken down over time. So there's certainly those things in our soil. Organic matter, such as compost, can be a source of macronutrients like nitrogen, as well as micronutrients, manganese, and zinc. Now, there are other nutrients that are needed, but a lot of Minnesota soils do not need very much of those other nutrients. Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen comes from air and water. We have great air up here. We have good water. So you're not going to have to worry about those too much. Calcium, sulfur, and magnesium are usually sufficient in most Minnesota soils, unless your soil is really sandy. So again, those aren't other nutrients. You're not going to have to go out and buy, 10 bags of nutrients. And then micronutrients are needed in small quantities, such as iron, manganese. I don't even know the name of that one. Chlorine, boron, copper, and zinc. Molybdenum. And they're usually also said to be sufficient in Minnesota soils. Gina?
I was going to say it's molybdenum.
Okay. I haven't ever had to add molybdenum to my
Yeah.
soil.
Most of the time, the micronutrients are there in the soil. unless you grew something really funky, which
Yeah.
you wouldn't survive up here in this weather.
Well, and when you think of it, you know, it sounds like a complex thing to get all these nutrients in your soil. But basically why I'm telling you this is it's not as intimidating as you might think, because we have a lot of those nutrients already. Let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so this is the results of my soil test that I had in 2021. And at that time, my soil texture was considered to be coarse. I had 14% organic matter. And when I looked at the recommendations they gave me, because you can see the amount of phosphorus was high in my garden, and potassium was quite high. And I don't know if I've cut off anything there, but my pH was a little over 7.5. So it was higher than I would have liked. But when I looked at the recommendations they gave me, don't add any lime, don't add any phosphates, don't add any potash, and add 0.15 pound of nitrogen for 100 square feet. Well, my garden is 4 by 10. The garden I had back then, which was 40 square feet. So there was just a little bit of nitrogen to be added. But really that isn't the whole picture here, because there's that consideration of what are you going to be planting? Because if I was going to be planting tomatoes, then some of this soil would be just fine. But it might have more nitrogen than needed for some plants and so on. So you kind of need that full picture. But I have just continued since then to work on my soil, adding nutrients each year, adding cover crops in the fall so I can keep putting nitrogen back into my soil. And so some of the things that you do to work on your soil, the best time to do it, to add nutrients, especially if you're adding organic products, is in the fall, because if you're adding aged manure, you're adding a fertilizer of that type, aged manure. If you add that in the fall, it has time to work into your soil and be ready in the spring to help your plants grow. If you wait and to put it in your soil a week before planting, it's not going to be ready for your plants to take in those nutrients as quickly. But there are years that, depending upon what you're growing, like I harvest potatoes late, I harvest carrots late. And so the garden that has those root kind of crops, that harvest is late, and I don't have time to do, to have a month or 2 months of ground that isn't frozen that I can add stuff to. Once I harvest those potatoes and carrots, it's pretty darn close to firm ground that I'm digging them out of. So getting them in the fall is the best if you can. Gina, is there anything you want to add to this part?
No, I think you got it all covered pretty much.
Okay, let's go on to the next slide. What does all that mean? Well, we've kind of talked about what it means. I needed to add a small amount of nitrogens to my soil. It noted that my soil was high in phosphorus and potassium, and the pH was a bit higher than needed for many vegetables. But the results told me that the mineral balance in my soil wasn't outrageously bad, but it's something that I continue to work on. So what treatment? The first year I added blood meal and some Dr. Earth organic fertilizer to my raised bed. In the fall, I planted a cover crop of legumes in my garden, because when you do that, those are things that will come up in the fall when you don't have any intention of using them. And then you'll just turn the ground over before frost with those legumes that you've grown, and they'll decompose during the fall. And then in the spring, that nitrogen will be ready to help your next crop. So according to the University of Massachusetts Extension, they say that nutrient levels will come down over time through plant uptake and weathering. So waiting is sometimes the best option. So that's kind of how I could console myself and say, well, you know, those numbers are higher than I would like, the potassium and the phosphorus, but probably waiting is the best option when it's not off the charts bad. I also add organic amendments for specific crops, such as bone meal and organic tomato fertilizer and so on. And gardeners can add organic or inorganic materials to enhance their soil. And it's helpful to understand a fertilizer label when you're shopping for soil amendments, so you know what you're looking for. Gina, do you want to talk a little bit about what kinds of amendments you put in your soil?
Well, I use mainly compost. And then also because I cover my raised beds with straw to use as mulch to keep weeds down and also to keep moisture in. In the fall, I turn that under. So it kind of decomposes over the course of the winter. I have a tendency to use inorganic fertilizer because it's readily available to the plants. And some vegetables are high feeders. So organic where is it might be preferable to use organic. Organic fertilizers take a while to be available to the vegetables. So I just go with a plain inorganic 10-10-10. And in my container plants, vegetables, and in my raised beds, those that are heavy feeders, I side dress with an inorganic fertilizer.
Okay. So let's go to the next slide. The numbers on a fertilizer label tell you what proportion of the product is nitrogen. That's the first number. Phosphorus, P, is the second number, and potassium, N, is the third number. So as Gina explained, inorganic fertilizers do not contain carbon and are generally manufactured water-soluble products, and they can provide a rapid delivery of nutrients in liquid form, or you can get a sort of a time release type of inorganic nutrients as well, which will add nutrients to your garden throughout the summer. So some plants need a boost at the beginning, but then they still need to sustain that, that fertilizer over the course of the year. Organic fertilizers are carbon-based and they're derived from living organisms such as fish emulsion or blood meal. And they're usually considered to be slow release. They are more expensive and may be difficult to calculate precise nutrient content and application rates. And so what I work very hard to do is to use organic fertilizers if I can. And so again, now when I do the soil test this year, that will tell me if what I am doing is getting, you know, am I creating and maintaining healthy soil, or am I going to need some kind of an inorganic fertilizer in the beginning to make one of my gardens to be more productive for what I'm putting in that garden? So that soil test will tell me. A lot of times, like for mine, for instance, if I was using an inorganic fertilizer with the soil test I had, the only thing that was low was nitrogen. So I would have needed to find an inorganic fertilizer where the first number was very high, and it might have been, say, a 10-0-0 or something like that. So it was just nitrogen going in. So those numbers are important to understand, and certainly by reading your own soil test, and if you want to consult a friend who gardens a lot or a master gardener to help explain some of those things more, that might be helpful if you're one of the beginning gardeners. We can go on. Okay, so this is what I just was talking about, the organic fertilizers that are carbon-based. they usually considered slow release. And then some of the examples, I use blood meal, I use tomato fertilizer, which is basically chicken manure. So that's the kind of tomato fertilizer that I have. Fish fertilizer, which is a 5-1-1. The tomato, you can see it's low in nitrogen, but it's much higher in the phosphorus and potassium. And then some of the other organic practices that have been mentioned. Inorganic fertilizers do not contain carbon and are generally manufactured. And really, a lot of times people will use a combination of the two, because someone who uses inorganic fertilizer they're going to be doing a lot of the practices that Gina described, which is just the practices of good gardening. Cover your after your plants come up in the garden, cover your soil with straw to keep the ground cool, to keep the moisture in, and then breaks down and it further improves the quality of your soil. So, I think probably we both can dabble in both of those things, and that's part of being a successful gardener. The one thing you need to remember is you should avoid adding excessive amounts of fertilizer, as it can burn plants and it can pollute the groundwater with excess amounts of phosphorus. So that's one of the things you need to be careful of in using fertilizers. As I said before, a little bit is good, more is probably not good. Go by the recommendation on your soil test. We can move on. Okay, and I've listed some organic fertilizers and inorganic fertilizers here for nitrogen, some things you could do. Blood meal, I mentioned that I needed that because that was my soil test told me that. But blood meal has like 13, the percent would be mostly nitrogen, and then phosphorus, and then no potassium. And so fish fertilizer is the same way. I use a lot of fish emulsion when I'm starting my plants, and the seedlings come up and their second set of leaves form, and they need a little bit of fertilizer beyond what the potting soil you first started with. And I dilute the fish emulsion fertilizer way down and add that into my water that I'm using when I water those plants. Phosphorus, organic fertilizers would be colloidal phosphate or weathering soil particles. But in the inorganic fertilizers, you would look at ratios where the numbers are higher for the second number. And they are well suited for transplants and can be applied when plants are set in the ground. And then there's potassium. That's the other big main fertilizer that you would want to add. Some organic options would be bone meal. And you can see the numbers there in terms of what percentage of what or what amount it is. But you can also use wood ashes, lime, or green sand. Wood ashes, we don't have a fireplace that we burn inside. But wood ashes I don't know, do you have wood ashes that you add to your garden, Gina? That's
Yes.
a very good organic thing to add if you want to add some potassium to your soil.
I have lots of wood ashes, and matter of fact, I always make sure I add 2 buckets to my compost pile and then mix it all in.
Yeah, that's one of the recommendations, is to add it to your compost. So if you have a lot of outdoor fires, don't just get rid of the ashes, use them. And then the calcium and magnesium would be the weathering soil particles. And you can get that also with kelp or dolomitic limestone. Sometimes we'll refer to something as add a little side dress of dolomitic limestone. And some plants need that during the course of the growing season. Anything, Gina, that you want to mention in terms of the use of fertilizers?
No, it's just that, as you've mentioned before, with inorganic fertilizers especially, do not overuse them, because it doesn't take much to burn the roots and kill the plants. So just be very careful, and whatever the recommendation is, use about 2/3 of it. Because I once attended a talk on gardening by Robin Trott, who is a extension educator, and she has a flower farm. And she had a good point that the manufacturers of fertilizer, they want you to use their product and come back and buy more. And she says, as a general rule for her, she uses half the amount and then increases the time in between by twice. So it's better to err on the side of less than err on the side of more.
Yeah, I think that's a
That
good.
in mind, I
recommendation.
actually have 2 questions in chat there about that. Do you want to hear those now, or do you want them for a little bit later?
Sure. We can hear them now. That would be fine.
Yep. Can having too many coffee grounds in your compost hurt your soil?
No, coffee grounds is a good aerator for your soil, and it's your compost. You wouldn't want to add it directly to your garden as much as you would want to add it to your compost. And it's actually considered brown matter in a compost. So you know how you use green things in your compost, that would be your vegetable scraps that you're putting in there and all that type of thing. But then you need those things that heat it up, and that's the brown things such as torn up paper bags and coffee grounds and dry grass clippings and straw. All those things can be put in your compost bin, and that helps heat it up and breaks it down so you can use it in your garden. So coffee grounds are fine.
Wonderful. So the next question I have is, I have access to a large amount of multi-year composted cow manure. My dad is a farmer. Would it be fine to use only that to fill my raised beds, or could it be harmful to my plants? I will be focusing on vegetables this year.
I would not use just, so we've got soil in the raised bed, and then we're adding the manure on top, the aged
No.
manure.
Nope, it would just be an empty bed that they would be filling with the manure.
No,
Would be
no,
composted cow manure,
Yeah.
so many a year.
no, there needs to be soil, because without soil, you don't have the nutrients from the soil to develop the plant. So you would basically burn your plants, even if it's aged. Yeah. Usually you would think of like a couple inches that is dug in 5 to 6 inches deep on top of garden soil, but you would not have that as your sole kind of soil. It's, yeah. Gina, do you want to add something to that?
What I would add to that is well-aged manure is just should be just used as a supplement to the soil, as an amendment. And as Sally recommended, 2 inches on top of the soil that you work in, maybe 3 inches. But I certainly would not do a whole raised bed with well-aged manure, because it just won't support the growth. You're going to kill it. It's just, it doesn't have enough stuff in there, other micronutrients and stuff like that to support the growth.
That's a little bit like saying, can I just use my compost and use that as my garden soil? The compost isn't going to burn the plants like the manure would, but compost alone is not going to grow a good garden. You do need that soil. And so, that's the hard thing up here is getting the soil. Because in some places there's not a lot of it, because some people, your house is built on rocks. And yeah, that is the hard part, but it is an absolute essential if you're going to have a successful garden.
Then somebody else asked, what about vermicompost, VERMI compost?
VE what?
VERMI compost, vermicompost, worm compost?
Oh,
You mean worm castings?
yeah, they're really good in the garden. I have worm castings. that I put, but that can't be your sole source of, I mean, it just looks rich and wonderful and it is good, but it's basically adding just a really good quality compost. I use mine as a top dressing after I've planted seeds many times, because it's a really nice texture for your seeds to emerge from the soil, and it is really good at holding water. And so it keeps your soil, your seeds moist, but not drowning in, in water. So vermicompost is really, really great to add as a supplement, but it can't be the only thing.
Wonderful. Well, I think you can keep going forward.
Yeah. Okay, so the benefits of organic materials. My soil test that we looked at indicated I only needed a small amount of nitrogen. So I could either purchase an inorganic product with a label such as 1000 or add organic nutrients. So I chose to add the organic nutrients, including blood meal and compost. And regardless of which fertilizer you choose, consider adding organic material to support overall health. And that's what Gina was describing, that she might use the inorganic fertilizer, but she is using her organic materials to support the health of her garden. Organic materials provide carbon to feed microorganisms. They increase soil organic matter, and it improves the overall health of the soil. So overall health of that soil with the organic materials is what allows your carrots to grow downward and come out of the ground without breaking because it's stuck in such or not being able to grow to their proper length because there's so much clay in the soil. So adding organic material to soil improves the water holding capacity in sanding soils. It increases the drainage and aeration in clay soils, and it suppresses weed growth and reduces the soil temperature and moisture fluctuations. So it can reduce the need for supplemental fertilizers. So you want to add that organic material to your soil as well. We can go on. So working to improve the soil. So in my first raised bed, I used my experience as a gardener to work on building the soil prior to getting a soil test. I knew that my soil was really marginal and that I needed time and organic material to create good soil in a new location. So I decided to work on improving the soil for a couple of years and then followed with a soil test. So I ordered double sifted soil from Thorson's for the first raised bed. Soil had many rocks, so I sifted it again. And then to work on the soil texture and water holding capacity, I purchased a couple bags of compost because I didn't have compost bins yet. And then I added some perlite to aerate the soil. And the perlite is like that little white, it's kind of like broken up styrofoam. It doesn't break down, but it does aerate heavy soil. And I definitely, from around my house, there was some heavy soil backfill that had been put around the house that they removed when they put a sidewalk in. And that's what I was starting to garden in. I added the dry grass clippings from the yard during the growing season. And then we purchased 2 compost bins so we could make our own compost to add to the garden in the future. And since that time, I've added 2 more raised beds. I purchased my soil from Macmillan from those beds. And each year I add aged manure purchased and then my own compost. I turn over the dry straw that was used during the growing season. And I plant cover crops in the fall and add natural additives to maintain the soil of the health. And so I will send another soil sample in this spring to test my soil and use the information to inform my amendment plan for this year. Gina, is there anything I should mention that I didn't mention about improving the soil?
Are there any more options for getting soil up here?
Duluth dirt is a long way to haul dirt. But we have hauled from Duluth dirt before. When you can't get it up here. And I have heard that Thorson's don't sell black dirt anymore. And I don't know, Macmillan's have that spot just east of town. And I was pretty pretty pleased with what I got from them as a starter when I got the soil from them. But I don't know if anybody else is selling it up here.
I wonder if David Berglund from Lakeview Dairy Farm sells black dirt.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
he does.
Okay. So that would be another source.
Yep.
Okay. And if anybody else knows of a source, I mean, that's a common question up here is where do you get dirt? And the
So-
other
Somebody
challenge
did message into the Q&A, but that in Anoka County, there's a compost site that has had a garden mix that we could purchase, and that worked great for them. So another location, not in Cook County, but another location.
Yeah, and one of the challenges because of north of the cities, because they've had a pretty significant problem with jumping worms in the last few years, bringing soil up from any place, any part of our state, or even Wisconsin that are dealing with jumping worms, you know, you don't want to bring that to Cook County and you don't want to bring it to your garden because it's just going to decimate anything you have growing. So that is the other caution is be careful where you get your soil if you're getting it out of Cook County. We have not had any incidents of jumping worms in Cook County. We can move on. Were there any questions, Gina, that we need to answer?
Nope, I think we took care of them.
We have one more that's in the
Oh.
Q&A, and it's not exactly in line with this, but there's the dolomitic limestone also helped to keep slugs away.
I have not used
DOL.
it to keep slugs away, so I don't know if it has that potential or not.
And I haven't used it either to keep slugs away. I've used eggshells that I've smashed up to keep slugs away, but not dolomitic limestone.
So
If somebody
that-
has used it, you could put it in the chat and share some of your best experiences.
yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you. And we can move on. Okay, so the results. This is a picture of the first raised bed a couple years after I started. I started with one raised bed the first year. I knew it would take some time to transform my dirt into rich and healthy living soil. And then a soil test won't change your soil. However, knowing the results of that test give you the information you'll need to change and improve your soil. So clearly, you know, from going from basically dirt from around the house full of clay and rocks, you know, the garden was it was really productive. And my gardens have been productive. They aren't anymore. They aren't in that location any longer because it was too close to an evergreen tree that really was growing fast and started limiting the sunlight that the plants were getting. So we did move our raised bed gardens. My husband said that we were lucky we did it when we did because he probably would never do it again because it was work. So make sure your garden is in a place that is not going to be hampered by the size of a tree in the near future. Okay, so let's move on. Some tools to build healthy soil. So we compost year round and we get a lot of healthy compost for our gardens. I have two bins side by side. When one's full, you know, I turn it over into the other one. But as I mentioned before, you need your, you know, your vegetable scraps and things like that, your eggshells, your coffee grounds, but then you also need your brown things. You need, I use paper towels that are made from bamboo. So I stick that in there as a brown material. I use paper bags I might rip up, or I might shred some newspaper. And you want to keep your compost lightly moist, but not soaking wet. But you do want it to heat up to get the products to break down and turn into what looks just like soil. And that's why I can understand the question when someone said, well, can you just use your compost as your soil? Because it looks like soil and it looks beautiful, except it needs the minerals that are in the actual black dirt soil to grow. I also, before I add to my garden, I sift my compost. My husband built me some sifters that you see right there. And that way, I know I'm not putting anything large in there that a seedling can't emerge through, or that roots can't grow down because it might be too large. And this was taken in the winter time, but my husband built a 3-compartment little soil shed for me, where we keep one with black dirt and then usually a couple with compost. And then, like right now, they're pretty low because I added compost in the fall to my gardens. I have a little more black dirt in the one that's covered with snow, but it's just handy to have those things on hand. So when you compost, some of those little critters in the soil are going to eat that compost up and break it down. So it's a never ending thing. That's why you want to be able to make your own if you can, because then you can just keep adding every year and mix it in with your soil. Okay, let's move on. So what's in your soil? Your soil is home to billions of microorganisms and bacteria and fungi and nematodes, insects and earthworms, and they all play a role in your soil health, and they don't charge you for it. So some of the cast members of this are bacteria and fungi, and I have a little picture of that there. And they break down dead plant and animal tissue, which becomes nutrients for your plants. So, you didn't have to go buy them. They just are there and they do that for you. And then there's the nematodes, and that's that bottom picture there. They eat plant material and other soil organisms, and they release plant nutrients in their waste. Well, that sounds a little bit gross, but you really can't tell it's waste. It looks like it's black dirt. So it really helps things grow. And then the specialized fungi, they form mutually beneficial relationships with plants, such as bringing water and hard to reach nutrients to plant roots, and the plants provide the fungi with carbohydrates. And so, that's really just one of those beautiful things about gardening is those little microscopic things that we can barely see are doing work for us in the garden. So it's just sort of the gift. Okay, let's move on. Worms and insects are good for the soil. So they shred and chew organic material into smaller bits that bacteria and fungi can easily access. And then the earthworms burrow in your soil, and they create pathways that fill with air and water for the plant roots. So it allows water to get down to the roots of your plants where the worms create those little pathways, and they keep it the air, so the roots of your plants can grow and stretch. And like I said before, your carrots grow straight down, and your potatoes grow and do beautiful things. So one note though, earthworms are not native to Cook County. They're fine if they show up in your garden, but never dump fishing bait in forested areas or move soil with earthworms in it. And since the jumping worms have arrived in Minnesota, you have to be cautious about hauling in soil from outside of Cook County. And at first, when you see a jumping worm, it moves different than an earthworm, but it's going to look like an earthworm. And they lay tiny eggs that are hard to they look like it's just soil. But then that next year, even though the earthworm or the jumping worms died, the ones that you could see, those eggs, just millions of eggs, are planted in that soil, and it's very hard, and they just can decimate trees and gardens, perennials. Wherever they find a home, they can just completely destroy your garden. Okay, we can go on. So organic matter improves the physical properties of soil, like we said before. And you can see that in this little garden, there's straw in between. I wait for the seedlings to emerge, and then I add straw that keeps that soil cool, as I mentioned before. This is early season. Things are just kind of emerging from the ground. The organic matter is composed of the living plant roots and organisms, decomposing plant and animal parts. in various stages of decay and enzymes that are secreted by them. That acts like glue to bind soil particles. And as soil organisms break down the organic parts of your soil, the nutrients become available to plants. And then the plants feed the soil organisms with their remains. So highly decomposed plant material is called humus, a stable and important source of plant nutrients and great for growing things. So the one thing nice about a raised bed is because it's a more manageable size, and because you every year add the straw, add whatever the compost that you add and mix with your original soil. Your original soil is going to stay there. Your compost is going to break down, and that's why you need to keep bringing up that soil and mixing it with your compost. But it's going to have the good aeration that it needs for plants to grow easily and for roots to spread and expand. So the organic matter is really an important part of your soil. So even if you wanted to spend a ton of money and go down and pick up a load of black dirt from someplace, and you filled your entire raised bed with that, instead of also having the organic matter from the compost and the aged manure and things like that, your garden is not going to be as successful. It's both things that are needed for the successful garden. Not just the soil and not just the compost or the aged manure, but the combination is what brings a successful garden to you. Okay, we can go on. Okay, so after I planted my seeds or plants and the soil is warmed in the spring to 70 degrees, that's when I add the layer of straw mulch on the soil once the seedlings have emerged. So you don't want to put that on cold soil, because the sun is going to be attracted to the dark colored soil and warm it up faster. And so I don't add that top dressing of straw until my soil warms up to 70 degrees. And then the mulch will help retain soil moisture, keeps the soil cool, keeps water from splashing on the leaves of your plants, and eventually breaks down to improve the soil texture. And I noted earlier, I mentioned to you that I'll send a soil sample into the U of M again this year, because it is recommended every 1 to 3 years. And if your garden is doing well and you don't think there's any concerns, I've even heard 1 to 5 years. But you really want to understand what soil you have by getting that baseline. And that it'll help you monitor what condition your soil is in, and to verify what decisions you're going to make about nutrients to add in the future to your garden. So you can see also the little white things sticking out from where the potatoes and onions are growing. There's 3 of them across there. Those are PVC pipes that have a nozzle on one end that I hook the garden hose to. And then my husband has drilled holes in those PVC pipes. And so that is how I can water my plants without the leaves getting real wet. All of the moisture goes down directly into the soil. And of course, by having that cover of straw that you see, that keeps the soil from evaporating real rapidly. So it's a way of conserving your water as well as building your soil. We can go on.
Quick question, when you say 70 degrees, are you talking the weather is 70 degrees or that it is 70 degrees like
soil temperature? Yeah, I keep a soil thermometer in each of my gardens, especially in the spring, because they're, for instance, a crop that you can plant quickly would be, you can plant beets, you can plant peas early. But if you stick a bean in the ground when it's cold, that thing's just going to rot in the ground and never germinate. So you don't want to plant your seeds all on the same day, and you want to know the soil temperature of your garden. So that's why a soil thermometer. You don't have to have one in each garden. I just happen to like it that way because when I put my plastic covers on in the spring, because I'm close to the lake and the lake is very cold. It's, going to be 30, probably 35 degrees when I start doing some garden things in April. So I need to get plastic hoops on the gardens to start warming that soil. And when I can avoid that cold temperature coming from the lake and get warm during the day from the sun shining on those the plastic in those hoops, my garden can warm up much faster and I can get about a month earlier gardening in. When I do
Somebody
it
asked, how far down do you measure for temp?
well, I stick my thermometer probably down a good 6-7 inches. Yeah, and I think my soil thermometers cost like $5 each or something. They're really inexpensive. Okay, we can go on to the next one. Okay, what garden tasks help build the soil? And I mentioned some of the things, but after harvesting the crops in the summer or the fall, I plant a cover crop on the bare soil. And a cover crop is any crop grown to cover the soil and later be incorporated in the soil for enrichment. And I think I mentioned earlier, I usually use a legume type of crop because that adds nitrogen to the soil. And then in the fall, you just leave it in the soil. You can turn it over earlier, but I usually wait till after at least we have a frost. And then I just turn it over then. And that way it's not like a grass type of cover crop that's going to come up in the spring and then you're going to deal with trying to get rid of that grass that's growing in your garden, where the legumes like pea seeds and bean seeds and stuff like that. And you put it in your, after you've harvested the things in your garden, you put those in, put them under a little bit of soil, water it, and it'll just come up all over. And then turn it over in the fall if it hasn't frozen yet. And then it'll start breaking down and that nitrogen is going to go into your soil. So you can order some of those crops really inexpensively. I just usually order a bag of some legume based ones and put it on and then turn it over, and then your nitrogen is taken care of in the spring when you're ready to start planting. If I have something that I harvest late, like potatoes or carrots, then I might put the cover crop in the soil in the fall, but let it come up in the spring and grow, underneath the plastic hoops in the spring, let it grow in there a little bit before I turn it under. I also add aged manure to the garden and mix it in. As I said earlier, it's best to add the organic amendments in the fall because they're not fast acting amendments like a fertilizer that you might purchase. And if I'm not done harvesting earlier, I have planted my cover crop early in the spring to put those nutrients in just because I want to get it done. Okay, we can move on. Gina, were there any questions that were asked that we should talk about, or did you want to add anything about soil nutrients?
The one thing I want to add about using straw as a mulch that occurred to me as we were talking about it is to make sure it is aged at least 1 year, has gone through 1 full year of precipitation of any kind, like that it got rained on during the spring and summer and fall, and it got snowed on during the winter. And then you can use it the following spring, just because you don't know what kind of herbicides the farmer used in his field when the straw was harvested. And that way it gets rinsed off with all the rain and snow. So I make sure that my straws age, I think mine is usually aged 2 years before I put it in use in the vegetable garden. So that's one thing I was thinking of that we should probably mention.
If you're new to it though, is there a best practice? Because somebody probably isn't going to wait 2 years to start gardening for the first time. Is there any suggestions that they would do if they were going to buy it from the store tomorrow?
You mean go out and buy a bale of straw?
Yeah.
I would bury it underneath as much snow as you can.
Yeah, I usually buy more straw than I need, and like right now I have a nice bale that's really been rained on for, for a long period of time. It's gone through the winter. It'll be ready to use in the spring. But then I'll also go in the spring and get more so it can start aging. Um, and you can usually get that just at the home center in town is where I go to buy the straw, but there's other sources. Where do you get yours?
At the home center.
Okay,
Because
yeah.
if I go to any local person, they'll sell me hay, and you don't want hay because hay
Mhm.
has all those noxious
Seeds.
weeds and
Yep.
seeds in it and stuff. You do want straw because it's not full of weeds and stuff. And unfortunately, there's really no way around the fact that it needs to age at least a year with all the rain and snow to make sure that the herbicides are off. I mean, you can try, if you're going to get it now and bury it underneath the snow. I mean, at least where I live, I've got at least 3.5 feet of snow cover. So I could technically bury it underneath the snow and it'd probably wash off at least 65% of it. And
And just getting it in and putting it away from where you're going to be growing things, but just watering the heck out of it and getting a lot of, if we had a lot of rains, you could count on some of that, but otherwise just getting the hose out there and just running fresh water through it and then letting the sun hit it and then cook it up a little bit before you start putting on your garden. And you're not going to put it on till your soil temperature is warmer anyway. So even if you want to cut the timeline a little bit, really, really run fresh water through it and turn your bale a couple different ways and have it going, the one way and then another way just to get as much flushed out of there as you can.
or spread out cut the strings off your bale that is keeping it in the cube shape and kind of loosen it up so that you have more straw exposed to the water or whatever.
And sun.
Mhm.
Okay, okay, so watch for signs of common nutrient issues in vegetables. So plants that lack nitrogen, which was one of the things in my first soil test, you might see yellowing on the older lower leaves, or too much nitrogen can cause excessive leafy growth and delay fruiting. And one year I did plant some spinach, or no, some beets. And I thought the beets were doing really well. And what was actually happening was there was too much nitrogen in that garden. And the beets were not developing under the ground, but their leaves were just gorgeous. And yeah, that's nice if you want to have salad greens from your beets, but I kind of like that beet to make my pickles and canned beets. So it's like, oh my goodness, my nitrogen was a little off in that garden. So just something to be careful of. Plants lacking phosphorus, they might show stunted growth or a reddish purple tint in leaf tissue. And I haven't had that happen. Gina, have you experienced that in anything?
No.
Okay. Potassium deficiency can cause browning of leaf tissue on the leaf edges, starting with the lower older leaves, and I haven't had that either. And calcium deficiency leads to tip burn on younger leaves or blossom end rot in tomatoes or zucchini. And they could also, those symptoms can be caused by uneven watering or excess moisture or damage to roots. So I haven't had those show up either. Gina, have you?
I had blossom end rot in my tomatoes for the first time last year, but it was just one variety of tomato.
Oh.
And as it turns out, it wasn't a calcium deficiency, it was by uneven watering.
Oh, okay. Yeah, in these years where we have a lot of those extended periods of dry weather, that can be really, really hard to keep up with that. So uneven watering can happen, or if you have to take a vacation and come back and then you feel like, okay, I need to really give some good water here because they've been without for a week. Yeah, that can cause a problem. Okay, let's move on. Plant roots and microbes need air and water for optimal growth. So that's why you incorporate the compost into the compacted soil, because it's going to increase your air and water and nutrients. So incorporate 1 to 2 inches of compost and mix it 6 to 8 inches deep, because you need both. You need that soil and you need that compost. Both things are essential for a really healthy garden. And soil compaction and disturbances like excessive tillage can eliminate the important micronutrients, microenvironments that you need. So I don't use a tiller in the garden at all. I just use kind of like a hole, kind of with a big prong, and mix this compost and the soil together, because I don't want to kill all those little microorganisms in there that are benefiting me in so many ways. So you can minimize soil compaction by using designated pathways through the garden. My gardens at home are 4 feet wide, so I never have to walk in the raised beds. I can walk all the way around them. But at my WTIP garden, I have some old wooden planks that I have put in kind of in a T shape from one end of the garden to the next, so I can avoid stepping on the soil where I have things planted. And you can use a pitchfork in your garden to avoid tilling the soil, because a pitchfork's not going to kill all those natural organisms that add to the health of your soil. But by using, going in, and I honestly, I will admit, my first year at WTIP, the garden that I was given was as hard as a rock. I honestly couldn't hardly get a pitchfork down into it. So we did do a tilling with a little electric tiller for the top 4 inches, and just got it loosened up. And then every year I've been working hard on building amendments in there, and now it's nice to work with. But at the time it was like a parking lot, and I didn't know any other way to really get that dug up. And consider using hand tools, because disturbed soil also disturbs weed seeds, exposing them to light and increasing germination. So just carefully using hand tools so you're not disturbing everything in the garden is important. And we can go on. So these are the needs of some plants that you might want to grow. And so you want to get to know your favorite vegetables and what they need to thrive, so you can use appropriate amendments or do things based on your soil test. So green beans, they don't like acidic soil. So if you do the soil test and you find out you have acidic soil, you can add lime if necessary, or wood ashes if you have them. So you wouldn't add lime just because maybe my green beans are in acidic soil. You need to know. You just don't add things to your soil just anticipating problems until you know your soil better. Beets like phosphorus, so you can add colloidal phosphate, bone meal, and potassium. Green sand and wood ashes also can work, but again, you need to know about that. Your phosphorus, the year my beets were all tops, I should have added phosphorus, and I had nitrogen producing crops in there the year prior, and that was the problem. There was too much nitrogen and not enough phosphate, and I should have been thinking about that when I planted them in there. Broccoli likes colloidal phosphate, wood ashes, kelp, and dolomitic limestone. But again, your soil test will tell you what to add. Carrots or cabbage likes organic matter, compost, or aged manure into the top 6 inches of soil. Carrots incorporate organic matter, wood ashes, or green sand for the potassium, and colloidal phosphate or bone meal for phosphorus, and kelp for trace elements. And cauliflower, add colloidal phosphate, wood ashes, and kelp meal. So again, you're going to have access to this PowerPoint, but all of those are just some tips for what those things like. So based upon your soil test, you'll know what to add. And we can go on because I've got a few pages of just tips for little certain crops. Oops, can we go back to page 2? Nope, back, yep. Cucumbers add lime if the soil is acidic, because they don't like a low pH, and they dislike salt. So watch what kind of manure you use. Sometimes manure that's not aged sufficiently has more salt in it. Lettuce has a weak root system, so the soil needs to be quite fertile. And so it needs moderate amounts of potassium, wood ashes or green sand, and phosphorus. So you can add colloidal phosphate. And if it's low in calcium, add some dolomitic limestone. Onions, they need potassium as well. So give them wood ashes or green sand. If the pH is low, add lime. Peas, they like colloidal phosphate and green sand, and peppers as well. So, you know, that knowing what kinds of things like what is also a way of planting them in the same garden, because that way you can treat, like if you have a raised bed, you can treat the raised bed with for plants that like some of the things that we're mentioning here. Let's go to page 3. And potatoes, if it's the soil's too alkaline, add sulfur, pine needles, or another acidifying agent. Never lime the soil when planting potatoes. Radishes don't need much nitrogen, so don't add fresh manure. They do like potassium and phosphorus. And spinach loves manure. Tomatoes, you should put a handful of bone meal or colloidal phosphate in the planting hole to supply phosphorus for early growth and good fruit set. And potassium is also important while the plants are young, so add a handful of green sand or wood ashes in the planting hole. Okay, just some tips on specific crops. A little more on the value of mulch. Mulch or cover crops can be used to protect the topsoil from erosion, and they add organic matter as they decompose. And mulching bare soil around plants prevents splashing of soil particles and soil-borne pathogens onto the leaves and stems. So you have less disease if you have the ground mulched. And they conserve moisture, so it minimizes weeds, reduces plant stress by moderating soil temperatures. So it really saves you work, it saves you time, and it creates a better garden. So that mulch is certainly worthwhile. We can go on. So rotate your crops in your garden. So planting the same crop in the same soil year after year can increase diseases. So you can reduce diseases by rotating your crops. And I use a 4-year cycle because I have 2 bigger gardens at home, and one at WTIP and one at the community center. So like this year in my small home garden, I will have what I call fruits. That would be tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. In my large home garden, I'll have leaves and legumes, and that's going to be, you know, lettuces and peas and beans and chard and things like that. WTIP, I will have my root vegetables and onions. And at the community center, I'll have the brassicas and some pollinator flowers. And so it'll be the 4th year before anything gets back to where they're being planted this year, because that way I plant things that get along with each other and have similar needs in terms of amendments. And so that way I can adjust what I'm doing in the garden accordingly. You want to prevent nutrient depletion, so you'll plant with long roots, like plants with long roots like carrots. They absorb nutrients deep in the soil, and then shallow rooted things like onions absorb the nutrients toward the top few inches of soil. And legumes like beans and peas, they add nutrients back into the soil. So when your legumes die, the nitrogen becomes available to other plants in the rotation. So crop rotation is usually based on plant type families to some degree. Plants in the same family are often susceptible to similar pests and diseases and tend to have comparable nutrient cultural requirements. So that's why having a cycle, you're not going to put those same plants back in that same garden, you know, for 4 years. Or if you have a large garden, you would just divide it into 4 parts. So I just don't happen to have a large garden, but you could take one garden and plant it into 4 parts. And then we can go on.
And just being mindful of people's time. I know that we're hitting 8 o'clock, so there might be some more things that we might be talking about, but we understand if you do have to leave at this point, but we'll have a recording for you to keep going if you want to. And we do have a
Yeah.
question in the chat.
Okay.
Is it fine to use lawn clippings as mulch? Should it sit for a while to keep weeds from sprouting up?
I would, well, if you're not spraying your yard, that's important. And if you don't have a lot of weed seeds in your yard, but I do put dry grass clippings on. I layered on the mulch I already have, but I let them dry first. Gina, how about you?
My lawn clippings go into the compost, so they get composted. I don't use lawn clippings because I've got undesirable weeds that would just love to be in my garden, my vegetable garden, and they would just take over, like sheep sorrel, hawkweed, and all that. So no,
And probably your compost heats up enough that those seeds are not going to do anything.
it's just a miracle how that works.
Yeah, works well.
Yep.
And then we have one more question. We have 6 inches of awesome hummus and it's 6 foot of clay. We are trying to decide if we should plant directly in the soil or make raised beds. Any recommendations?
I would go with raised beds, but I haven't gardened in clay, but my daughter has clay. We tried and we built raised beds at her house because there was no aeration in there, and the amount of work it would take to make that a viable garden, raised beds were just a much easier solution.
Raised beds were invented for anybody with clay soil. Trust me.
Okay, so you're going to determine your soil amendments. It's going to be based on the results of your soil tests. And I've just listed some reminders, things that I might do, but I'm not going to do until I know what the soil test is, because we're giving you all kinds of suggestions, but the suggestions aren't valuable unless it's pertinent to your soil. So let's turn the page and look at some of the possibilities. Like, for instance, I'm planting broccoli, and it needs to grow fast for best quality. It needs lots of moist, well-drained soil, lots of organic matter. All that I can do. Prepare the soil by incorporating 2 to 3 inches of aged manure or compost in the top 6 to 8 inches. I'm going to do that. But now the yellow part, I'm not going to do that till I get the soil test, because broccoli likes calcium, magnesium, dolomitic limestone if there's a high pH in the soil. I don't know what the pH is going to be. You might also add colloidal phosphate, wood ashes, kelp, dolomitic limestone, but I don't know if I need to add that. Broccoli should not be planted where another brassica has been grown in the past 3 years. Well, that one I know, because I know where I had mine planted last year. So they were at WTIP. They aren't going to be there. They're going to be at the community center garden this year. So that's not a problem. And same with cabbage. It's a hungry plant, must have rich soil to produce well. And they prefer heavy soil with lots of organic matter to retain moisture. So it likes lots of available nutrients, especially potassium and phosphorus. But I need to know what those levels are. Are they adequate already, that I'm not going to need to add any, or do I need to add it? That's what my soil test will tell me. And then there's potential micronutrient deficiencies that include boron and manganese. And kohlrabi is the same way. Likes light, rich, moisture, retentive soil, lots of organic matter. That I'm going to do. Incorporate 2 inches of compost. That I'm going to do. Doesn't need a lot of nitrogen, but it does like potassium with green sand and wood ashes. Well, I'm going to see what my soil test tells me. And I have listed, we can turn the page, and I have listed, you'll have access to this, but there are several examples for other things. Did someone have a question in the chat, or Kelsey?
Yep, and Gina's been doing a great job of responding to those. So I think we're good.
Okay, cucumbers. nothing that I have to do real specific to the soil, but traditionally planted in hills, you can dig a large hole 12 inches in diameter and 12 inches deep and fill half of it with the compost, and then return the rest of the soil to the top, and that produces a raised mound. That raised mound will warm up more quickly and provide good drainage for your cucumbers. So that's just a tip for cucumber growing. But peppers, for soil prep, peppers like a deep, loose soil, rich in all plant nutrients, especially magnesium. They don't like salt. So you're going to dig 2 inches of compost or aged manure deeply into the soil, along with colloidal phosphate for phosphorus, green sand or wood ashes for potassium and kelp. I'm not going to do those things till I see the soil test. Tomatoes, they aren't fussy about soil, but generally they do better. Better soil produces better tomatoes, but they do prefer a pH neutral soil. And they're heavy feeders, so they're going to use a lot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and a lot of potassium. And tomatoes have deep roots that go down 5 feet, so it's important that your soil temperature is 60 degrees or higher for planting tomatoes. Get out that thermometer again. Black plastic can help warm up your soil, or I use the covers to cover my gardens to warm up the soil in the whole garden. But now tomatoes will be at one of my gardens, so I have plastic covers, but I don't have plastic covers at WTIP and the community center. But the one thing that's knowing some of the tips will show you is, 2 gardens can be planted side by side, and one can be more successful and one is less successful, just based on knowing little tips. So when you plan your garden, you're going to draw it out, keep a copy so you can move different plants to new locations each year. And if this is your garden and you just have 4 zones, just remember, if broccoli and other brassicas are in zone 1 year, you're going to move them to zone 2, and then you're going to move them to zone 3, and then you're going to move them to zone 4. So you'll draw out your garden diagram, and you keep a copy so you can move things from year to year. You're not going to remember, so that's why you keep a copy. And even if you don't have multiple gardens, you can rotate crops. Decide what you want to plant, order the seeds so you can get the varieties that you want. The racks that you see at stores, they have a limited selection. And so by going online and ordering from some of the reputable seed companies, you can have a much larger choice. Some of the tomato plants that I've started, for instance, and I have ordered from Seed Savers for those seeds, and they're heirloom seeds. So the taste hasn't been bred out of to try to take care of some problem that this tomato had at some point in time, or they want all the tomatoes to be the same size. They've lost some of the good taste, but the heirloom seeds do produce great crops. And then purchase your soil amendments so you have them on hand when it's time to plant. And I have amendments that I've mentioned I might use. I have all of those on hand ready to go, because you use them in moderation, but by the end of last year, I was pretty much out of everything that I had. So, okay, next slide. So just a FYI, you have access to the PowerPoint, and the written resource list will be provided to you. And I will get that to Kelsey so she can send that out. Pairs of master gardeners do site visits to gardens upon request. So for instance, Gina and I visited garden last year. I've gone with other master gardeners. We usually go in pairs because sometimes one of us have had experience in one area and the other has not, or vice versa. But all gardening questions are good questions, so please feel free to follow up and ask. You can email us to ask questions at any time. It's just been our pleasure to pass on some knowledge so you can be successful gardeners as well.
Sally, there's
Yeah.
one question that I would like your help in answering.
I hope I can answer it.
Well, yes, you can, because it asks, where do you buy organic garden amendments?
Oh, I usually order mine online. In fact, yeah, I just got a box with some things a couple of weeks ago. Yeah, with green sand and some of the other things. But I usually just go on Amazon and have them delivered because it's cheaper than a trip to Duluth, and I usually can't get them in town.
And as far as buying seeds, I already, recommended Seed Savers, Bedco, Burpees, Livingston. But I also want to say, if you're in Duluth, going to Gordy's, which is on Miller Trunk Highway, they have a lot of the seeds from these different companies, but they have exceptional gardeners there, and they harvest their own seeds from their own vegetables and package them for sale, this next growing season. And I have bought 2 years in a row those seeds and have had excellent results with them, and they're reasonably priced. So that's another source.
That's a good tip. I think the other thing to remember is, because so many new people are gardening, the seed racks, and Bucks carries in the co-op, they sell a good brand of seeds, but they're disappearing fast. And there's been so many people who haven't been able to get seeds because they didn't buy early. And so that's the other reason why we have a couple of really good sources in town. And I don't know, does the Blue Moose sell seeds?
They will later on when they open, but they don't open until Mother's Day.
Okay, so I like to be guaranteed I've got the varieties that I want early. So that's the other reason I usually order.
Yeah,
Understanding there's some at the seed library at Cook County.
Yeah,
Extension.
that's a good thing to mention. And if you have seeds that you don't plan on using and you want to donate to the seed library, that's also a good thing. But if you want to help with some seeds, I know that Sarah has gotten some donations. Last year it was in pretty good shape, but we went through a lot of seeds when I was volunteering there. And I know she was feeling that wasn't as well stocked, because usually at the end of the season, Bucks will give extra seeds if there's any left over, but there weren't. So there weren't as many in there, but she has gotten some more donations now, so that's been great.
Yeah, I saw that Leanne was just posting that there was a bounty in right now, so.
Great.
That's